Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to Emily, the latest member of our Patreon family. Emily, thank you so much for being a supporter of this podcast. Your help makes it possible, and it's much appreciated. If you're interested in learning about the perks available to subscribers, including monthly episodes found nowhere else, you can visit www.patreon.com/boringbookspod or follow the link in the show description. Now, let's get to the reading. Tonight, we're returning to a book that seems to have captivated many of you. Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland by Dr. Samuel Johnson, first published in 1775. Let's pick up where we left off, with Dr. Johnson's tour of the Isle of Skye and the surrounding islands. Raasay. At the first intermission of the stormy weather, we were informed that the boat, which was to convey us to Raasay, attended us on the coast. We had from this time our intelligence facilitated and our conversation enlarged by the company of Mr. McQueen, minister of a parish in Skye, whose knowledge and politeness gave him a title equally to kindness and respect, and who from this time never forsook us till we were preparing to leave Skye and the adjacent places. The boat was under the direction of Mr. Malcolm MacLeod, a gentleman of Raasay. The water was calm, and the rowers were vigorous, so that our passage was quick and pleasant. When we came near the island, we saw the laird's house, a neat modern fabric, and found Mr. MacLeod, the proprietor of the island, with many gentlemen expecting us on the beach. We had, as at all other places, some difficulty in landing. The crags were irregularly broken, and a false step would have been very mischievous. It seemed that the rocks might, with no great labor, have been hewn almost into a regular flight of steps, and as there are no other landing places, I considered this rugged ascent as the consequence of a form of life inured to hardships, and therefore not studious of nice accommodations. But I know not whether for many ages it was not considered as a part of military policy to keep the country not easily accessible. The rocks are natural fortifications, and an enemy climbing with difficulty was easily destroyed by those who stood high above him. Our reception exceeded our expectations. We found nothing but civility, elegance, and plenty. After the usual refreshments and the usual conversation, the evening came upon us. The carpet was then rolled off the floor. The musician was called, and the whole company was invited to dance. Nor did ever fairies trip with greater alacrity. The general air of festivity which predominated in this place so far remote from all those regions which the mind has been used to contemplate as the mansions of pleasure, struck the imagination with a delightful surprise, analogous to that which is felt at an unexpected immersion from darkness into light. When it was time to sup, the dance ceased, and 36 persons sat down to 2 tables in the same room. After the supper, the ladies sung Erse songs, to which I listened as an English audience to an Italian opera, delighted with the sound of words which I did not understand. I inquired the subjects of the songs, and was told of one that it was a love song, and another that it was a farewell composed by one of the islanders that was going in this epidemical fury of emigration to seek his fortune in America. What sentiments would arise on such an occasion in the heart of one who had not been taught to lament by precedent, I should gladly have known. But the lady by whom I sat thought herself not equal to the work of translating. Mr. MacLeod is the proprietor of the islands of Rasse, Rona, and Flodda, and possesses an extensive district in Skye. The estate has not, during 400 years, gained or lost a single acre. He acknowledges MacLeod of Dunvegan as his chief, though his ancestors have formerly disputed the preeminence. One of the old Highland alliances has continued for 200 years, and is still subsisting between MacLeod of Rasse and MacDonald of Skye, in consequence of which the survivor always inherits the arms of the deceased, a natural memorial of military friendship. At the death of the late Sir James MacDonald, his sword was delivered to the present Laird of Rasse. The family of Rasse consists of the Laird, the lady, 3 sons, and 10 daughters. For the sons there is a tutor in the house, and the lady is said to be very skillful and diligent in the education of her girls. More gentleness of manners, or a more pleasing appearance of domestic society, is not found in the most polished countries. Rasse is the only inhabited island in Mr. MacLeod's possession. Rona and Flodda afford only pasture for cattle, of which 160 winter in Rona, under the superintendence of a solitary herdsman. The length of Rasse is by computation 15 miles, and the breadth 2. These countries have never been measured, and the computation by miles is negligent and arbitrary. We observed in traveling that the nominal and real distance of places had very little relation to each other. Rasse probably contains near 100 square miles. It affords not much ground, notwithstanding its extent, either for tillage or pasture, for it is rough, rocky, and barren. The cattle often perish by falling from the precipices. It is like the other islands, I think, generally naked of shade, but it is naked by neglect, for the laird has an orchard, and very large forest trees grow about his house. Like other hilly countries, it has many rivulets. one of the brooks turns a corn mill, and at least one produces trouts. In the streams or fresh lakes of the islands, I have never heard of any other fish than trouts and eels. The trouts which I have seen are not large. The color of their flesh is tinged as in England. Of their eels I can give no account, having never tasted them, for I believe they are not considered as wholesome food. It is not very easy to fix the principles upon which mankind have agreed to eat some animals and reject others, and as the principle is not evident, it is not uniform. That which is selected as delicate in one country is by its neighbors abhorred as loathsome. The Neapolitans lately refused to eat potatoes in a famine. An Englishman is not easily persuaded to dine on snails with an Italian, on frogs with a Frenchman, or on horseflesh with a Tartar. The vulgar inhabitants of Skye, I know not whether of the other islands, have not only eels, but pork and bacon in abhorrence, and accordingly I never saw a hog in the Hebrides, except one at Dunvegan. Rosse has wild fowl in abundance, but neither deer, hares, nor rabbits. Why it has them not might be asked, but that of such questions there is no end. Why does any nation want what it might have? Why are not spices transplanted to America? Why does tea continue to be brought from China? Life improves but by slow degrees, and much in every place is yet to do. Attempts have been made to raise roebucks in Rosse, but without effect. The young ones it is extremely difficult to rear, and the old can very seldom be taken alive. Hares and rabbits might be more easily obtained. That they have few or none of either in Skye, they impute to the ravage of the foxes, and have therefore set, for some years past, a price upon their heads, which, as the number was diminished, has been gradually raised from 3 shillings and 6 to a guinea, a sum so great in this part of the world that in a short time Skye may be as free from foxes as England from wolves. The fund for these rewards is a tax of 6 in the pound, imposed by the farmers on themselves, and said to be paid with great willingness. The beasts of prey in the islands are foxes, otters, and weasels. The foxes are bigger than those of England, but the otters exceed ours in a far greater proportion. I saw one at Armadale of a size much beyond that which I suppose them ever to attain, and Mr. McLean, the heir of Cole, a man of middle stature, informed me that he once shot an otter of which the tail reached the ground when he held up the head to a level with his own. I expected the otter to have a foot particularly formed for the art of swimming, but upon examination I did not find it differing much from that of a spaniel. As he preys in the sea, he does little visible mischief, and is killed only for his fur. White otters are sometimes seen. In Rosse they might have hares and rabbits, for they have no foxes. Some depredations, such as were never made before, have caused a suspicion that a fox has been lately landed in the island by spite or wantonness. This imaginary stranger has never yet been seen, and therefore perhaps the mischief was done by some other animal. It is not likely that a creature so ungentle, whose head could have been sold in Skye for a guinea, should be kept alive only to gratify the malice of sending him to prey upon a neighbor. And the passage from Skye is wider than a fox would venture to swim, unless he were chased by dogs into the sea, and perhaps then his strength would enable him to cross. How beasts of prey came into any islands is not easy to guess. In cold countries they take advantage of hard winters and travel over the ice, but this is a very scanty solution, for they are found where they have no discoverable means of coming. The corn of this island is but little. I saw the harvest of a small field. The women reaped the corn, and the men bound up the sheaves. The strokes of the sickle were timed by the modulation of a harvest song, in which all their voices were united. They accompany in the highlands every action which can be done in equal time, with an appropriated strain, which has, they say, not much meaning, but its effects are regularity and cheerfulness. The ancient proselytismatic song by which the rowers of galleys were animated may be supposed to have been of this kind. There is now an oar song used by the Hebrideans. The ground of Rasse seems fitter for cattle than for corn, and of black cattle I suppose the number is very great. The laird himself keeps a herd of 400, 100 of which are annually sold. Of an extensive domain which he holds in his own hands, he considers the sale of cattle as repaying him the rent, and supports the plenty of a very liberal table with the remaining product. Rasse is supposed to have been very long inhabited. On one side of it they show caves, into which the rude nations of the first ages retreated from the weather. These dreary vaults might have had other uses. There is still a cavity near the house called the Oar Cave, in which the seamen, after one of those piratical expeditions, which in rougher times were very frequent, used, as tradition tells, to hide their oars. This hollow was near the sea, that nothing so necessary might be far to be fetched, and it was secret, that enemies, if they landed, could find nothing. Yet it is not very evident of what use it was to hide their oars from those who, if they were masters of the coast, could take away their boats. A proof much stronger of the distance at which the first possessors of this island lived from the present time is afforded by the stone heads of arrows which are very frequently picked up. The people call them elf bolts, and believe that the fairies shoot them at the cattle. They nearly resemble those which Mr. Banks has lately brought from the savage countries in the Pacific Ocean, and must have been made by a nation to which the use of metals was unknown. The number of this little community has never been counted by its ruler, nor have I obtained any positive account consistent with the result of political computation. Not many years ago, the late laird led out 100 men upon a military expedition. Rossi had therefore 600 inhabitants. But because it is not likely that every man able to serve in the field would follow the summons, or that the chief would leave his lands totally defenseless or take away all the hands qualified for labor, let it be supposed that half as many might be permitted to stay home. The whole number will then be 900, or 9 to the square mile, a degree of populousness greater than those tracts of desolation can often show. They are content with their country and faithful to their chiefs, and yet uninfected with the fever of migration. Near the house at Rasse is a chapel unroofed and ruinous, which has long been used only as a place of burial. About the churches in the islands are small squares enclosed with stone, which belong to particular families as repositories for the dead. At Rasse there is one, I think, for the proprietor, and one for some collateral house. It is told by Martin that at the death of the lady of the island, it has been here the custom to erect a cross. This we found not to be true. The stones that stand about the chapel at a small distance, some of which perhaps have crosses cut upon them, are believed to have been not funeral monuments, but the ancient boundaries of the sanctuary or consecrated ground. Martin was a man not illiterate. He was an inhabitant of Skye, and therefore was within reach of intelligence, and with no great difficulty might have visited the places which he undertakes to describe. Yet, with all his opportunities, he has often suffered himself to be deceived. He lived in the last century, when the chiefs of the clans had lost little of their original influence. The mountains were yet unpenetrated, no inlet was opened to foreign novelties, and the feudal institution operated upon life with their full force. He might therefore have displayed a series of subordination and a form of government, which in more luminous and improved regions have been long forgotten, and have delighted his readers with many uncouth customs that are now disused, and wild opinions that prevail no longer. But he probably had not knowledge of the world sufficient to qualify him for judging what would deserve or gain the attention of mankind. The mode of life which was familiar to himself he did not suppose unknown to others, nor imagined that he could give pleasure by telling that of which it was, in this little country, impossible to be ignorant. What he has neglected cannot now be performed. In nations where there is hardly the use of letters, what is once out of sight is lost forever. They think but little, and of their few thoughts none are wasted on the past, in which they are neither interested by fear nor hope. Their only registers are stated observances and practical representations. For this reason, an age of ignorance is an age of ceremony. Pageants and processions and commemorations gradually shrink away as better methods come into use of recording events and preserving rites. It is not only in Rasse that the chapel is unroofed and useless. Through the few islands which we visited, we neither saw nor heard of any house of prayer except in Skye that was not in ruins. The malignant influence of Calvinism has blasted ceremony and decency together, and if the remembrance of papal superstition is obliterated, the monuments of papal piety are likewise effaced. It has been for many years popular to talk of the lazy devotion of the Romish clergy. Over the sleepy laziness of men that erected churches, we may indulge our superiority with a new triumph, by comparing it with the fervid activity of those who suffer them to fall. Of the destruction of churches, the decay of religion must in time be the consequence. For while the public acts of the ministry are now performed in houses, a very small number can be present, and as the greater part of the islanders make no use of books, all must necessarily live in total ignorance who want the opportunity of vocal instruction. From these remains of ancient sanctity which are everywhere to be found, it has been conjectured that, for the last 2 centuries, the inhabitants of the islands have decreased in number. This argument, which supposes that the churches have been suffered to fall only because they were no longer necessary, would have some force if the houses of worship still remaining were sufficient for the people. But since they now have no churches at all, these venerable fragments do not prove the people of former times to have been more numerous, but to have been more devout. If the inhabitants were doubled with their present principles, it appears not that any provision for public worship would be made. Where the religion of a country enforces consecrated buildings, the number of those buildings may be supposed to afford some indication, however uncertain, of the populousness of the place. But where by a change of manners a nation is contented to live without them, their decay implies no diminution of inhabitants. Some of these dilapidations are said to be found in islands now uninhabited, but I doubt whether we can thence infer that they were ever peopled. The religion of the Middle Age is well known to have placed too much hope in lonely austerity. Voluntary solitude was the great act of propitiation by which crimes were effaced and conscience was appeased. It is therefore not unlikely that oratories were often built in places where retirement was sure to have no disturbance. Rasse has little that can detain a traveler except the laird and his family, but their power wants no auxiliaries. Such a seat of hospitality amidst the winds and waters fills the imagination with a delightful contrariety of images. Without is the rough ocean and the rocky land, the beating billows and the howling storm. Within is plenty and elegance, beauty and gaiety, the song and the dance. In Rasse, if I could have found a Ulysses, I had fancied a Phoecia. Dunvegan. At Rasse, by good fortune, MacLeod, so the chief of the clan is called, was paying a visit, and by him we were invited to his seat at Dunvegan. Rasse has a stout boat built in Norway, in which with 6 oars he conveyed us back to Skye. We landed at Portree, so called because James V of Scotland, who had curiosity to visit the islands, came into it. The port is made by an inlet of the sea, deep and narrow, where a ship lay waiting to dispeople Skye by carrying the natives away to America. In coasting Skye, we passed by the cavern in which it was the custom, as Martin relates, to catch birds in the night by making a fire at the entrance. This practice is disused, for the birds, as is known often to happen, have changed their haunts. Here we dined at a public house, I believe the only inn of the island, and having mounted our horses, travelled in the manner already described, till we came to Kingsborough, a place distinguished by that name because the king lodged here when he landed at Portree. We were entertained with the usual hospitality by Mr. MacDonald and his lady Flora MacDonald, a name that will be mentioned in history, and if courage and fidelity be virtues, mentioned with honor. She is a woman of middle stature, soft features, gentle manners, and elegant presence. In the morning we sent our horses round a promontory to meet us, and spared ourselves part of the day's fatigue by crossing an arm of the sea. We had at last some difficulty in coming to Dunvegan, for our way led over an extensive moor, where every step was to be taken with caution, and we were often obliged to alight, because the ground could not be trusted. In travelling this watery flat, I perceived that it had a visible declivity, and might without much expense or difficulty be drained. But difficulty and expense are relative terms, which have different meanings in different places. To Dunvegan we came, very willing to be at rest, and found our fatigue amply recompensed by our reception. Lady MacLeod, who had lived many years in England, was newly come hither with her son and 4 daughters, who knew all the arts of southern elegance and all the modes of English economy. Here, therefore, we settled, and did not spoil the present hour with thoughts of departure. Dunvegan is a rocky prominence that juts out into the bay on the west side of Skye. The house, which is the principal seat of MacLeod, is partly old and partly modern. It is built upon the rock and looks upon the water. It forms 2 sides of a small square. On the 3rd side is the skeleton of a castle of unknown antiquity, supposed to have been a Norwegian fortress when the Danes were masters of the islands. It is so nearly entire that it might have been easily made habitable, were there not an ominous tradition in the family that the owner shall not long outlive the reparation. The grandfather of the present laird, in defiance of prediction, began the work, but desisted in a little time and applied his money to worse uses. As the inhabitants of the Hebrides lived for many ages in continual expectation of hostilities, the chief of every clan resided in a fortress. This house was accessible only from the water, till the last possessor opened an entrance by stairs upon the land. They had formerly reason to be afraid, not only of declared wars and authorized invaders, or of roving pirates, which in the northern seas must have been very common, but of inroads and insults from rival clans, who in the plenitude of feudal independence asked no leave of their sovereign to make war on one another. Skye has been ravaged by a feud between the two mighty powers of MacDonald and MacLeod. MacDonald, having married a MacLeod, upon some discontent dismissed her, perhaps because she had brought him no children. Before the reign of James V, a Highland laird made a trial of his wife for a certain time, and if she did not please him, he was then at liberty to send her away. This, however, must always have offended, and MacLeod, resenting the injury, whatever were its circumstances, declared that the wedding had been solemnized without a bonfire, but that the separation should be better illuminated, and raising a little army, set fire to the territories of MacDonald, who returned the visit and prevailed. Another story may show the disorderly state of insular neighborhood. The inhabitants of the Isle of Eigg, meeting a boat manned by MacLeods, tied the crew hand and foot and set them adrift. MacLeod landed upon Eigg and demanded the offenders, but the inhabitants, refusing to surrender them, retreated to a cavern, into which they thought their enemies unlikely to follow them. MacLeod choked them with smoke, and left them lying dead by families as they stood. Here the violence of the weather confined us for some time, not at all to our discontent or inconvenience. We would indeed very willingly have visited the islands, which might be seen from the house scattered in the sea, and I was particularly desirous to have viewed Islay, but the storms did not permit us to launch a boat, and we were condemned to listen in idleness to the wind, except when we were better engaged by listening to the ladies. We had here more wind than waves, and suffered the severity of a tempest without enjoying its magnificence. The sea, being broken by the multitude of islands, does not roar with so much noise, nor beat the shore with such foamy violence as I have remarked on the coast of Sussex. Though while I was in the Hebrides, the wind was extremely turbulent, I never saw very high billows. The country about Dunvegan is rough and barren. There are no trees except in the orchard, which is a low, sheltered spot surrounded with a wall. When this house was intended to sustain a siege, a well was made in the court by boring the rock downwards till water was found, which, though so near to the sea, I have not heard mentioned as brackish, though it has some hardness or other qualities which make it less fit for use, and the family is now better supplied from a stream which runs by the rock from two pleasing waterfalls. Here we saw some traces of former manners, and heard some standing traditions. In the house is kept an ox's horn, hollowed so as to hold perhaps 2 quarts, which the heir of MacLeod was expected to swallow in one draught as a test of his manhood before he was permitted to bear arms or could claim a seat among the men. It is held that the return of the Laird to Dunvegan after any considerable absence produces a plentiful capture of herrings, and that if any woman crosses the water to the opposite island, the herrings will desert the coast. Boetius tells the same of some other place. This tradition is not uniform. Some hold that no woman may pass, and others that none may pass but a MacLeod. Among other guests which the hospitality of Dunvegan brought to the table, a visit was paid by the laird and lady of the small island south of Skye. It is commonly called Muck, which the proprietor not liking has endeavored without effect to change to Monk. It is usual to call gentlemen in Scotland by the name of their possessions, as Rosse, Bernera, or Lochbee, a practice necessary in countries inhabited by clans, where all that live in the same territory have one name, and must be therefore discriminated by some addition. This gentleman, whose name I think is MacLean, should be regularly called Muck, but the appellation, which he thinks too coarse for his island, he would like still less for himself, and he is therefore addressed by the title of Isle of Muck. This little island, however it be named, is of considerable value. It is 2 English miles long and 3/4 of a mile broad, and consequently contains only 960 English acres. It is chiefly arable. Half of this little dominion the laird retains in his own hand, and on the other half live 160 persons, who pay their rent by exported corn. What rent they pay we were not told, and could not decently inquire. The proportion of the people to the land is such as the most fertile countries do not commonly maintain. The laird, having all his people under his immediate view, seems to be very attentive to their happiness. The devastation of the smallpox, when it visits places where it comes seldom, is well known. He has disarmed it of its terror at Muck by inoculating 80 of his people. The expense was 2 shillings and 6 pence a head. Many trades they cannot have among them, but upon occasion he fetches a smith from the Isle of Aick, and has a tailor from the mainland 6 times a year. This island well deserved to be seen, but the laird's absence left us no opportunity. Every inhabited island has its appendant and subordinate islets. Muck, however small, has yet others smaller about it, one of which has only ground sufficient to afford pasture for 3 weathers. At Dunvegan I had tasted lotus, and was in danger of forgetting that I was ever to depart, till Mr. Boswell sagely reproached me with my sluggishness and softness. I had no very forcible defense to make, and we agreed to pursue our journey. MacLeod accompanied us to Ullinish, where we were entertained by the sheriff of the island. Ullinish. Mr. McQueen travelled with us, and directed our attention to all that was worthy of observation. With him we went to see an ancient building called a dun or burra. It was a circular enclosure about 42 feet in diameter, walled round with loose stones, perhaps to the height of 9 feet. The walls were very thick, diminishing a little toward the top, and though in these countries stone is not brought far, must have been raised with much labor. Within the great circle were several smaller rounds of wall, which formed distinct apartments. Its date and its use are unknown. Some suppose it the original seat of the chiefs of the MacLeods. Mr. McQueen thought it a Danish fort. The entrance is covered with flat stones and is narrow, because it was necessary that the stones which lie over it should reach from one wall to the other. Yet straight as the passage is, they seem heavier than could have been placed where they now lie, by the naked strength of as many men as might stand about them. They were probably raised by putting long pieces of wood under them, to which the action of a long line of lifters might be applied. Savages in all countries have patience proportionate to their unskilfulness, and are content to attain their end by very tedious methods. If it was ever roofed, it might have once been a dwelling, but as there is no provision for water, it could not have been a fortress. In Skye, as in every other place, there is an ambition of exalting whatever has survived memory to some important use, and referring it to very remote ages. I am inclined to suspect that in lawless times, when the inhabitants of every mountain stole the cattle of their neighbor, these enclosures were used to secure the herds and flocks in the night. When they were driven within the wall, they might be easily watched and defended as long as could be needful, for the robbers durst not wait till the injured clan should find them in the morning. The interior enclosures, if the whole building were once a house, were the chambers of the chief inhabitants. If it was a place of security for cattle, they were probably the shelters of the keepers. From the dun we were conducted to another place of security. A cave carried a great way underground, which had been discovered by digging after a fox. These caves, of which many have been found, and many probably remain concealed, are formed, I believe, commonly by taking advantage of a hollow, where banks or rocks rise on either side. If no such place can be found, the ground must be cut away. The walls are made by piling stones against the earth on either side. It is then roofed by larger stones laid across the cavern, which therefore cannot be wide. Over the roof turfs were placed, and grass was suffered to grow, and the mouth was concealed by bushes or some other cover. These caves were represented to us as the cabins of the first rude inhabitants, of which, however, I am by no means persuaded. This was so low that no man could stand upright in it. By their construction, they are all so narrow that two can never pass along them together, and being subterraneous, they must be always damp. They are not the work of an age much ruder than the present, for they are formed with as much art as the construction of a common hut requires. I imagine them to have been places only of occasional use, in which the islander, upon a sudden alarm, hid his utensils or hid his clothes, and perhaps sometimes his wife and children. This cave we entered, but could not proceed the whole length, and went away without knowing how far it was carried. For this omission we shall be blamed, as we perhaps have blamed other travelers, but the day was rainy and the ground was damp. We had with us neither spades nor pickaxes, and if love of ease surmounted our desire of knowledge, the offense has not the invidiousness of singularity. Edifices, either standing or ruined, are the chief records of an illiterate nation. In some part of this journey, at no great distance from our way, stood a shattered fortress, of which the learned minister, to whose communication we are much indebted, gave us an account. Those, said he, are the walls of a place of refuge, built in the time of James VI by Hugh MacDonald, who was next heir to the dignity and fortune of his chief. Hugh, being so near his wish, was impatient of delay, and had art and influence enough to engage several gentlemen in a plot against the laird's life. Something must be stipulated on both sides, for they would not dip their hands in blood merely for Hugh's advancement. The compact was formally written, signed by the conspirators, and placed in the hands of one MacLeod. It happened that MacLeod had sold some cattle to a drover, who, not having ready money, gave him a bond for payment. The debt was discharged and the bond redemanded, which MacLeod, who could not read, intending to put into his hands, gave him the conspiracy. The drover, when he had read the paper, delivered it privately to MacDonald, who, being thus informed of his danger, called his friends together and provided for his safety. He made a public feast, and inviting Hugh MacDonald and his confederates, placed each of them at the table between two men of known fidelity. The compact of conspiracy was then shown, and every man confronted with his own name. MacDonald acted with great moderation. He upbraided Hugh both with disloyalty and ingratitude, but told the rest that he considered them as men deluded and misinformed. Hugh was sworn to fidelity and dismissed with his companions, but he was not generous enough to be reclaimed by lenity, and finding no longer any countenance among the gentlemen, endeavored to execute the same design by meaner hands. In this practice he was detected, taken to MacDonald's castle, and imprisoned in the dungeon. When he was hungry, they let down a plentiful meal of salted meat, and when, after his repast, he called for drink, conveyed to him a covered cup, which when he lifted the lid, he found empty. From that time they visited him no more, but left him to perish in solitude and darkness. We were then told of a cavern by the seaside, remarkable for the powerful reverberation of sounds. After dinner we took a boat to explore this curious cavity. The boatman, who seemed to be of a rank above that of common drudges, inquired who the strangers were, and being told we came one from Scotland and the other from England, asked if the Englishman could recount a long genealogy. What answer was given them, the conversation being in Erse, I was not much inclined to examine. They expected no good event of the voyage, for one of them declared that he heard the cry of an English ghost. This omen I was not told till after our return, and therefore cannot claim the dignity of despising it. The sea was smooth. We never left the shore, and came without any disaster to the cavern, which we found rugged and misshapen, about 180 feet long, 30 feet wide, and in the loftiest, as we guessed, about 30 high. It was now dry, but at high water the sea rises in it near 6 feet. Here I saw what I had never seen before, limpets and mussels in their natural state, but as a new testimony to the veracity of common fame, here was no echo to be heard. We then walked through a natural arch in the rock, which might have pleased us by its novelty, had the stones which encumbered our feet given us leisure to consider it. We were shown the gummy seed of the kelp that fastens itself to a stone from which it grows into a strong stalk. In our return, we found a little boy upon the point of rock, catching with his angle a supper for the family. We rode up to him and borrowed his rod, with which Mr. Boswell caught a cuddy. The cuddy is a fish of which I know not the philosophical name. It is not much bigger than a gudgeon, but is of great use in these islands, as it affords the lower people both food and oil for their lamps. Cuddies are so abundant at some times of the year that they are caught like whitebait in the Thames, only by dipping a basket and drawing it back. If it were always practicable to fish, these islands could never be in much danger from famine, but unhappily in the winter, when other provision fails, the seas are commonly too rough for nets or boats. And with that image, I think we'll end this evening's reading from A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland by Dr. Samuel Johnson. I really love how he evokes both time and place in this travelogue. If you're interested in reading this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, send me a message via our website, www.boringbookspod.com, or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I'd love to hear from you. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.